Welcome to the Ask Historians Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Ask Historians Podcast. This week we're with moderator and flared user Iphikrates, here to talk about the beginnings of academic military history. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So this isn't the first time you've been on by any means, but we are talking about something chronologically that is kind of significantly later than what you've normally covered, which is specifically ancient Greek military history. But we're looking really at the 19th and 20th centuries here. So I guess the first lead-in question is, why the shift?
Yeah, this is a great question because I mean, every time I study this, I think, what am I doing? I'm completely out of my depth. But this is a historiographical project, which is to say that from studying classical Greek warfare, I moved on into the subject of earlier scholarship on that topic, which can seem a bit like navel gazing, like honestly, you're going to write about people writing about what you write about. But it actually has a lot of meaning within the study of history because you get to trace where certain ideas and frames of thinking come from. And that helps you to push your field forward, to sort of try and get people to understand how the kind of things that we do have come to be that way, and how we can learn from past scholarship in order to recognize the limitations, perspectives, terminology, and that kind of thing that we use. And so that's how I ended up looking at the early scholarship of Greek warfare as a way to understand how we still look at it. I found in the course of my PhD that a lot of the ways in which we understand Greek warfare and the ways in which we define it as a sort of very particular way of war that fits a very particular value system really derives from a set of scholarship from the 19th century that has more or less set this down as the way you should look at Greek warfare, and that it has been very, very difficult over the past century and a half to kind of move past that paradigm. And so it seemed to me really quite interesting to look at the earlier history of that. And then it turned out, as I dived into that, that there's actually a lot to say about the development of academic scholarship on the history of war in any period, in which the history of writing about Greek warfare is actually a very interesting case study. It's very intertwined with a much broader history of where does military history actually come from as a subfield of the study of history.
Now, I haven't heard you talk about this before, but I have seen you write about it before. And one thing you talk a lot about, very specifically, is a lot of Prussian and German historians. And on some level, yeah, it's kind of unsurprising that this all starts in Prussia. But as you noted, it is kind of surprising how it isn't the Prussian establishment, really, that is sponsoring this kind of study. So how did it start off, and why did it not come from within these sort of very official Prussian bodies?
Yeah, so on the one hand, I mean, this is kind of the first interesting thing about it. Like, the reason why they're all Germans is that the modern academic study of history as a concept, what is this academic field, basically emerged from 19th century Germany. So this is where you have the great theorists, people like Leopold Ranke, who basically establish what it means to study history in a modern professional university setting. So they are the ones who establish the standards for source criticism, for the contextualization of historical periods, all these kinds of things. And they move on the study of history from an almost political, moralizing, didactic practice into, a science, if you will. I mean, that's certainly what they may have wanted to call it. But in any case, a sort of responsible, critical, grounded, historicized way of looking at the past. And so it's not surprising that the early scholars that we're talking about are all Germans, because a huge amount of historical study in this period is first seriously done within the German-speaking world, and especially within Prussia. And towards the later 19th century, when the Prussian state obviously has united the German Empire under its banners, you see a huge amount of official government investment in intellectual institutions, museums, universities, which actually means a huge increase in the kind of study of topics like this, kind of studies like history, antiquities, things like that, in order to be internationally competitive. This is a new state. This is a state that has to stake out its claim to cultural relevance. And so they massively invest in the kind of things that they were already kind of intellectually leading pioneers in. such as the study of history. So by the late 19th century, a huge share, like a hugely disproportionate share of the world's academic historical studies being done in Germany. And of course, at the same time, I mean, this is a country that's shaped by war, right? Not just Prussia in general, which already has all these associations. When we think of Prussians, we think of uniforms, Frederick the Great, great battles like, against Napoleon, whatever. A state that, by the famous saying, it's not really a state with an army, but rather an army with a state, etc. So Prussia has this sort of militarized image. And of course, towards the end of the 19th century, Prussia unites Germany by winning wars. So they win a war against Denmark, then they win a war against Austria, and finally they win a war against France, which results in the foundation of the German Empire. So this is a state forged by war. And as soon as that happens, you have this new big player on the European theater, on the European stage, and they immediately anticipate that there is going to be trouble. There will be future wars. There will need to be more violence in order to establish the proper place of this state in the world order. And so, as soon as this new empire is established by violence, by means of war, the entire state is also geared towards preparing for the next war. And so war is everywhere in society. Everybody has to serve in the army. Many people have served in the army. Many people have seen battle during one of these three wars. And the entire society and political situation is essentially dominated by the question of, okay, where are we going to fight? Who are we going to fight? How are we going to do that? And in political questions as well, where the money is going to go in terms of preparation for future wars, one of their most important, policy issues. And so you can imagine that in a world in which history is very important and is a very big sort of new development and very prominent, and at the same time war is so central, we kind of imagine that this is the place where obviously military history is going to be a really big deal. And yet universities basically don't do this. They don't study military history. They don't have chairs in military history. They don't have military historians so defined. They have a lot of historians who want to write about military history every now and then. In their works it comes up. Sometimes they write individual studies about military history, but they don't acknowledge military history as a separate field of study. It just isn't a thing. Like there is nobody would call themselves a military historian, so to speak. And in fact, whenever anybody does write something on military history, there is a lot of pushback. And then the question is, how does that happen? Why is there pushback against doing something that seems culturally and institutionally almost to go without saying? And the answer there is fundamentally that because this society is so geared towards war, and because it holds its military in such high esteem, those members of the officer class, members of the military elite, are also regarded as very well-respected specialists in their own field. That field, of course, being warfare. So they're not just seen as practitioners who do violence, but they're also regarded as intellectuals within a particular scientific field, which is military science. And military history traditionally is regarded as part of that science. It is part of military science, and therefore it is not part of historical research. So, military history emerges from a long tradition, not of scholars studying the past, but rather of soldiers studying their profession. And this goes way back, in the 18th century and even beyond that. You have lots of soldiers who decide to study past warfare in order to learn lessons. They study past battles and this, as they survive from ancient descriptions and medieval descriptions, in order to learn how to engage tactical problems, how to organize armies, etc. And this develops into this kind of didactic literature for officers. And this is formalized in the 19th century as, the army becomes more and more important, as, warfare in the Prussian state becomes a sort of pillar of society and political power. It becomes formalized as part of what the army does in order to get better at war, to be better prepared for the next conflict. And so military history doesn't develop as part of the historical profession within the university. Rather, it develops within the army educational establishment, the Great General Staff and its dependencies, the War Academy, things like this. as a part of what officers do in order to study war. And those officers effectively tell historians, like, you don't understand this topic. This is our subject. We claim this as part of our profession. You don't know what this is like. You don't know what this is about. You don't understand what's important about it. You don't have the practical experience to value it properly. You don't have the educational background, the contextual background to be able to judge military historical questions. Military history is what we do, and you have to steer clear of it because you're just not an expert on this. And so, especially in a society which is, both the university and the army are professionalizing. They are both starting to regard their own way of doing things as sort of very high professional standard and formalizing that there are proper ways to do this, which you can study through years and years of experience and education, and then you will have exclusive expertise on that. And because the army is doing that also with regard to military history, historians simply can't say, well, this is part of history. You can't, we can do that as well. Instead, the army says, no, this is our expertise. Your expertise is all that other stuff, the political, diplomatic, cultural, religious, whatever. But when it comes to warfare, the concrete business of, fighting wars, fighting battles, waging war campaigns, etc., that is our field of expertise, and you can't touch that. And because of the prestige of the army in society, essentially the university says, fair enough. We accept that. And so there's just no room for people to study military history very, very explicitly and formally at the university, because the university will tell you, like, don't do that. That's not our thing.
Yeah, because obviously it's not as though the German Foreign Office went and claimed a monopoly on diplomatic history.
No, and that's the really interesting thing about it, is that you don't get a similar sort of sense of like the Farmers Association saying that historians can't write the history of farming, or, which is the example that is often raised by historians themselves. They will say, well, I don't need to know how to paint in order to write art history, so why is this such a thing with the army? But of course, that is precisely because the army is such a central pillar of society, and because officers have this huge status as being themselves, not just, as I said, doers of violence, but intellectuals of a particular form of science. And within that institutional body, within the army, you have the Great General Staff, which is specifically meant as essentially a research institute. They study things like cartography, geography, fortification, engineering, all sorts of things that are relevant to the army, but they also study military history for the purpose of instructing officers. And so you kind of have this parallel research body, this research institute, which has an enormous social prestige. And they're the ones who are basically saying, well, military history is part of what we do, and therefore it's not part of what you do. And that claim has to be respected simply because the army is such an enormous presence in society and such an enormously important presence in society. And because of the importance, because of the almost inevitability of the idea of another war is coming, there's going to be another big conflict, in which case this Great General Staff, the GGS, is going to be the institution that effectively rules the country in order to make this work for us. In order to win this war, the GGS has to essentially take over everything, right? Not just the railroads, the mobilization, but the whole of society is going to have to be run by the Great General Staff to make sure that we get maximum efficiency in this conflict. In order to make that work, in order to make people have faith in that, they have to believe the absolute authority of the GGS. They have to believe that they are infallible, essentially. Otherwise, this is just not a situation you ever want to be in. And so the GGS projects this as well. They project this image of infallibility, this image of we have ultimate wisdom on these matters. We have exclusive wisdom on these matters. Nobody else can tell us we're wrong. And because of that sort of combination of factors, warfare becomes one of the fields in which you have that claim very strongly enforced, where people will say you cannot write about military history if you're not a soldier, if you don't have practical experience and education in war.
But obviously, because we're talking about this, there's clearly some kind of pushback, which you seem to suggest came from both directions, that there were voices within the military establishment that were calling for a more nuanced approach to military history, as well as voices from outside the military establishment, essentially demanding rather that they should be allowed to take part as well.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting situation that you see in the course of the 19th century in Germany in general, where because of this sort of rising, because of modernization and industrialization, as well as this idea of the rising significance of the army in a period of great technological change, and various other, other factors that are occurring in this environment that I don't really have time or necessarily know how to get into. The point is, like, all forms of education in this entire culture tend towards technical professionalization. So instead of the older ideal of having a very broad-based education for a wide section of the population, in which, they would all read Greek and Latin and read the classics and then get a general introduction to history and language and all sorts of things. And then eventually they would learn what they need to learn for their profession once they picked it, Instead of that very broad-based idea of what the Germans call Bildung, so like education, for forming, sort of broad forming education, you have a tendency in the 19th century for all forms of education to become more and more specialized and technical. And that applies both in the university or in schools and universities, where there's less of a focus on, isn't all this nice? Don't you want to learn a general sense of history and literature and that sort of thing? Towards, Greek language, these are the grammar rules, these are the words, these are the things you need to know. And at the same time in the army, less of a focus on, let's make you officers into well-rounded individuals who can, maintain a conversation in a coffee house. Instead, turning them into, right, these are the characteristics of the weapons that you'll be needing. This is the characteristic of concrete. These are the things that you'll need to know in order to build a bridge. These kind of things. And obviously there's strong justification for this technical focus, in the sense that this is a period in which warfare rapidly changes and you need technical knowledge in order to keep up. But there is a lot of resistance against the idea that this is making them into better soldiers, because a lot of people say, well, if it would be better if they were sort of broad-based and human, essentially, and if they were more able to communicate with civilians, with officials, with civil servants, etc., that would actually be a better thing for them than to be very, very good at one particular thing, one particular technical skill. And so in the army and in universities, you have this tendency of people to say, let's reverse this. This is going bad places. We are becoming much too specialized. We are becoming very technical. In the army, the idea is that we're becoming essentially robots, and this is bad. We need to be broad-based officers. We need to be sort of an example to educated society. In the university, there is a tendency to think we're becoming irrelevant because we are so specialized that it is dry and boring and impenetrable from the outside. What we're doing looks like you need so many years of training to be able to understand what it even is, that it looks irrelevant to the average citizen. So you have some really wonderful essays by Nietzsche and Wagner and all these major 19th century figures basically saying, like, the study of antiquity has lost its way because now it's just boring text reading and grammar pedantry instead of the exciting stories that we actually want to know about. So in both of these fields, you have this sense that it's moving in a direction of technical specialism. And there are those who basically say, this is bad, this is going the wrong way. This means that people will turn away from us. This means that we are no longer turning our students into good, fully well-rounded individuals. And on both sides, one of the answers that is offered is, let's look more at military history. In the army side, that's to say, this is a form of history. It's relevant to you, but it also gives you a broader background, a broader reading, and a broader sense of humanity. Within the university, it is the idea that military history is one of the things that feels relevant. Because, as I said, all these forces in society that make warfare something very prominent for people, they're aware of it. They know that it will be part of their life. And so they will say, well, let's look at military history as something that invigorates you, that excites you, that makes you want to know more because it's relevant to you, because it's relatable. So military history is one of the ways in which you can actually make people feel like, history matters and the classics matter. And so from both sides, you actually get people on those grounds essentially saying, let's do more military history. Let's a sort of broad-based education in these things in order to create more well-rounded students. But as I said, in the university, that really cannot happen very easily because of the resistance against military history, because that is essentially ceded to the army. But meanwhile, in the army, this doesn't really land because of this progressive move towards technical specialization, which actually means that military history, although it is still, regarded as their domain, this is what they do, it is increasingly actually not what they do at all, because they don't think it's relevant to the modern technical questions that they're going to face. So military history actually fades from the curriculum at the War Academy. By 1890, it's barely there. So the idea that the army is supposed to be the one that does military history is essentially forfeited by the army itself. They stop doing it, more or less. Because it is, studying the history of antiquity in the Middle Ages is all very fun, but if you're studying how to overcome, a machine gun emplacement, it's not going to help you very much. And so they essentially reduce it further and further and further until when von Schlieffen is chief of the general staff, it just gets scrapped entirely.
So are you saying that Robin Hood 2018 lied to me about medieval tactics?
There may have been some slight inaccuracy.
Yeah, I guess drilling a little bit into specifics, because I think, in a sense, from both ends, there are some particularly interesting individuals who are kind of bucking the trend. I mean, the one that people have probably heard of is Hans Delbrück. But I guess before we get into Delbrück, simply because there just seems to be so much about him, in a past answer that I read before we started recording, you mentioned Max Jens as a figure sort of within the army establishment who seems to have been calling for what we've been talking about, this more nuanced view of military history. In a sense, both seem to have failed, but I guess the thing I'm trying to ask is, what were they really advocating? And then in turn, why wasn't it able to succeed? I mean, were they just sort of two individual? Is it just that these two individuals were lone voices amid these great currents, or were they just simply the most vocal, and there were bigger currents at work?
Yeah, so I mean, the examples that you mentioned, so Max Jens is actually, he's an officer, he works for the War Academy, he's part of the GGS for a little while. He is a soldier scholar in the sort of traditional sense. He basically dedicates himself to the intellectual pursuits of teaching officers, and he really strongly believed, so he's active from the 1870s down to the 1890s. He eventually leaves the army because he fails to get promoted, and he just gets fed up and retires, as you do. But all that time that he's active at the War Academy and for the years of his retirement, he's writing about general military history. And he strongly advocates this idea, he's a big representative of that movement that I mentioned earlier, who basically says, we should train officers more broadly. Officers should not just be taught simple, raw tactical details and technical details. They should be taught a general sense of military history. And particularly, he argues that military history should not be what it was for these officers previously. This tradition that I mentioned from the 18th century and before, in which military history is just a repository of useful examples. He says, no, this is not how we should treat history. History obviously needs to be, as the academy was saying at the time, as universities are propagating at the time, should be historicized. This is the Rankian idea that every era of history is unique to itself, right? So you cannot simply say whatever happened in that period can teach us relevant lessons about today. Instead, we should recognize that every army, every tactical development, every military organization is a product of its own time. And so he's advocating this idea of not just general military history as a useful thing for officers, but actually general military history in a very modern way, war in society. And he's not the first to do that either. There are people before him that he was already leaning on who were having a similar idea of military history should be embedded in its eras and should not be considered to be just a big catalog of relevant tactical details that you can mine for inspiration. And he was saying that from the War Academy, which is quite spectacular because it is in a period, although Moltke was still the chief of staff, and Moltke was a strong advocate of military history. Even so, the times were moving against him. Most of these people in the War Academy were saying, "Oh, this is not actually an effective way to get officers to know what they need to know for the next war." And so, while he was saying that, a lot of officers respected his work, enjoyed his work, positively evaluated his work, but it just wasn't able to turn the tide against increasing technical expertise. And that's generally what just the trend of that period. So that, as Jens produces more work, they also become less relevant to what the army is doing. So it becomes more and more something that he writes for a broader audience, really, for a wider public of people who are interested in military history, which is very much there in German society. There are a lot of people who want to read publications on military history that are sort of like more popularizing and accessible.
Yeah, which I think, of course, leads us pretty logically into Hans Delbrück, who's the one who comes from the opposite angle. One thing you mentioned to me was the Strategiestreit, which is a wonderfully alliterative term, but I have no idea what it means. So,
yeah, so this is a fantastic thing. So, briefly, I should mention Hans Delbrück. He's a scholar. He's in Berlin. He's a historian. He fought in the Franco-Prussian War, so he has military experience. He has military training. He saw really the very bloody end of that conflict, in the sense that he was in some of its bloodiest battles. But he is a historian. He's educated as a historian. He always has been sort of operating in academic circles. He is generally cited nowadays as the first military historian. So the first person to actually make military history into an academic pursuit. As I said, with people like Jens in the background, we can kind of question that. We can say, is that really true? But it is certainly true that he's the first person to try to be an academic historian who specialized in military history. That is something that nobody had done before, because, as I said, that was not done. That was something that the university didn't want and didn't accept. And so, indeed, he actually didn't get that honor either. He wasn't appointed as a military historian. He was never recognized as a military historian. He just did it, essentially. But his whole idea is that he was inspired by reading earlier works by Rustow and by Jens to doing sort of broad-based military history as an aspect of history. And he wanted to do that at the academy. And of course, when you're doing military history in the late 19th century, what you're effectively doing is not engaging in existing academic debates, because, as I said, those academic debates don't really exist. Rather, what you're engaging with is the army, is the GGS and its war history section. And so this is where this idea of the Strategiestreit comes from. This is, loosely translated, the war on strategy, the strategy struggle, if you want to keep the alliteration. Which is a fascinating debate that dragged on for more than 40 years. It's just a huge polemic between essentially Delbrück on the one side and the entire war history section of the GGS on the other side, and many others, getting involved in it. There's a monograph on this by Sven Lange, which traces all the publications in this that fit into this debate, and it goes right the way down from 1878 down to 1951. It's just generations of scholars arguing over this point. But what it boils down to is simply this. 1878, the GGS publishes a memoirs of Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great, of course, being the great king of Prussia, that the GGS idolizes as the greatest of past Prussian military leaders. He is the example to all of them. He is the one who has brought Prussia to unprecedented heights in the 18th century, and he's the one they should all take as an example of what a general should be like. They worship him. Like, he is absolutely a national symbol, and not just the army, but the entire nation essentially reveres Frederick the Great. And this memoir interprets his military philosophy and his military theory. And of course, because this is the GGS producing this, they essentially massage his military ideas to match the military strategy that is currently being prepared by the GGS. So they basically say, look, he confirmed what we are doing now. This was always a good idea. It has always been a good idea, and it is still today a good idea. to take this particular strategy, which is the strategy of decisive battle. So the GGS is preparing a kind of war which is similar to the war they won against the Austrians in 1866 and against the French in 1870, where you fight one giant battle with all of your army against all of their army and knock them out in one decisive blow, which establishes your superiority and reduces the length of war. That's their strategy. And so they went out into the works of Frederick the Great and tried to prove that he had also advocated this strategy, that this was the only strategy really that existed ever, and that everybody else is just like dabbling and not knowing what they're doing. That's the official army position. In comes Delbruck, who says, actually, that's not really what characterizes Frederick the Great's campaigns, is it? He wasn't trying to fight decisive battles because he knew that the risk to his very precious army was too great. So most of the time he was fighting limited battles and limited campaigns in order to exhaust his enemies rather than defeat them in a single decisive blow. And so where the army said there is only one strategy and it's always correct because it is our strategy, Delbruck actually said there are really two strategies. When you look at it, there's the decisive battle strategy, which is more of a Napoleonic thing. And there is what he called Ermattungsstrategie, so exhaustion or attrition as a strategy, the strategy of exhausting the enemy. And that's essentially all he said. And he said, okay, that's what you can see in Frederick the Great. And in fact, if you read Clausewitz, he already argues that, these are two different approaches to war. So that's fine. And the army just lost it. They could not have this civilian, right, this scholar, telling them that they had misunderstood Frederick the Great, A, misunderstood strategy, B, and C, that as a consequence of that, the strategy that they were preparing to wage the next war for the German nation might be wrong, because there are alternatives. They could not accept that this could ever be possible, right? This goes right into the heart of their claims to authority, their claims to professional skill, and their sense of who has and does not have the right to have opinions on these things. And in fact, when Hans Delbruck proposed this, you can see the significance of these kind of questions by the fact that there were questions in Parliament about this. Genuinely, somebody, a representative, questioned the Minister of Culture, says, who did you assign to a position at the University of Berlin? This man, who is essentially like a traitor, right? That's the framing that he was given, just for questioning the interpretation of the strategy of Frederick the Great. He was literally, there were questions as to the validity of his position as a scholar in Parliament at a national level. And obviously the army continued fighting this for decades, constantly going against Delbruck, constantly saying, look, you don't have any authority on this. You're wrong. We have the authority on military history, and this is how it is. Frederick the Great was an advocate of decisive battle. That is the only way to win wars, and that's how we're going to win the next war. And Delbruck just refused to give up and just kept on fighting absolutely everyone on paper in his various publications. Constantly offending everybody in sight, essentially up to the highest levels of authority, by simply arguing that, there might be more than one way of approaching war, because the GGS just couldn't have it.
So, as you noted, this kind of goes on into the 1950s, by which point you'd think that there'd been two wars in the middle where Delbruck would be proven right. How the hell does it last so long despite that?
Yeah, so this is the interesting. Obviously, Delbruck dies in 1929. The GGS actually is obviously dissolved after World War I. So in 1919, there is no more GGS, and this whole construct of institutions disappears. But the debate essentially rages on because, it's just not very clear which positions exist at that stage, obviously, and which positions may or may not be correct. But the big question is whether these scholars have actually correctly interpreted, or that either side has correctly interpreted the material, and whether there might be more to be said about this. So even into that period, you just get people butting in and saying, look, actually, I think you could nuance this further. Maybe there are three strategies, maybe there's a middle ground. The reason why it drags on is not necessarily because this is a very fruitful academic discussion, but just because there was so much writing on it, right? This is not just a matter of, okay, let's write some books about Frederick the Great, who cares? This is a matter of national significance, as I said, to the army, to the institute, to the university, to politics, to the king. The emperor, Wilhelm II, knew who Delbruck was. Like, he'd met him. These people know who, this is a small circle of elites interacting. And they just can't let these things go. And so if there's any way to try and get your, get your way in this debate, then people are still going to continue to try it. And obviously Delbruck, one of Delbruck's great characteristics, for better or worse, was that he would just never let go. He would never just say, okay, fine, have it your way, I don't care. He would just always keep on fighting his corner. And so right up to the end, he was still, willing to argue. He published on questions of strategy and ancient warfare right up to 1925, a few years before his death. He was still giving lectures on this, essentially after into his 80s, because he just wouldn't let it go. And that is one of the reasons why it remains such a relevant question. But also, of course, because those wars that you mentioned, especially the First World War, you could say, it proved Delbruck right, but actually it catapulted into the public consciousness the question of, even if he is right, did that actually help us? The fact that this became a war of attrition obviously destroyed Germany and destroyed so many lives on both sides of that war. So the question then becomes, is this actually wisdom to realize that there are several ways of waging war? Because, all this time we were trying to force a decisive battle. It would have been better if we could have had one, maybe. These kind of questions then, continue to show the interaction between historical debate and actuality. I mean, I could add that there are definitely people within the army who recognize what Delbruck was saying. I mean, he wasn't just sort of shouting at everyone and nobody would listen. I mean, in fact, Jaynes never explicitly, the scholar I mentioned earlier, Max Jaynes, never explicitly says, actually, guys, Delbruck is right. But he did agree. Like, in his writing on these matters, it's very clear that he sort of basically accepts Delbruck's arguments. But there are a lot of people who just didn't want to buy that. And that includes historians. There are definitely historians who would choose the side of the GGS in this debate and say, look, you don't know the first thing about this. Leave it to the professionals. So you definitely get sort of a mixture of two sides. This isn't just, either Delbruck on one side, everybody else on the other, or, the army against the university. It is more complex than that. But fundamentally what you're seeing is the way in which the development of military history as a discipline and its various possible positions is hampered by the fact that this is such an important aspect of current events, aspect of society and politics. You can't just write on this because there's so much writing on it in terms of reputations, expertise, prestige, and potentially the future of war, the future of the nation as they perceived it.
There remains a big open question here, which is, of course, how this ends, if it ever does. How the cleave is ever resolved and when.
Yeah, so, I mean, this ties into a couple of things that I've mentioned before. On the one hand, so the general narrative usually is that Delbruck is the one who breaks it because Delbruck becomes a military historian, right? And he works at the academy, so that's fine. So he becomes a university professor and he makes military history into something you can do at the university. That's clearly not true in the sense that while he does military history at the university for a huge number of decades, as I said, he's never actually made a military historian or a chair in military history. And he has in his career something like 75 PhD students, and none of them become lecturers in military history either. A few of them get to occasionally, write about it. They get to say something at the War Academy. Most of these people actually are completely persona non grata to the army for obvious reasons, being taught by Delbruck. And so they cannot actually do military history and get away with it. So when he dies, I mean, this field within the academy just disappears. Right? It doesn't come back until after World War II. So there is no institutionalization of military history in this period. It doesn't happen. On the other hand, and this is what I mentioned before, this idea of increasing technical specialization As I mentioned, it means within the army, first, that they claim military history for themselves and that they say, we have exclusive authority on this. But actually what it means towards the end of the 19th century is that they let it go because it is no longer immediately relevant to them, and they start to think that it is not the best way to educate officers. And so what you see instead is them more or less relinquishing military history, to the sense that they just don't do it anymore. But to the extent that they do it, arguing with Delbruck in particular, having to deal with an actual historian, has shown them that the way that they do it could do with learning from the professionalization that is going on in the university at this time. So as the university develops the methods of doing history, the army and its military historical section recognizes that maybe their methods are a little bit primitive and a little bit behind the times in terms of how university scholars do it. So by about 1900, you actually see officers from the war history section being sent to university to learn how to do history from historians so that they can take that back to the GGS and do it there, teach other officers. And so there is a growing sense in which, on the one hand, the army respects that historians have something to offer that they don't have. On the other hand, the army recognizes that this is increasingly just not relevant to what they have to learn. And so they gradually let that go a little bit. So that's what happens on their side. And then on the other side, in terms of the university, it's a more complex question, but what you see certainly in ancient military history is that there is an increasing sense that with the right encouragement, with the right background, with the right knowledge, and with the right advisors, for instance, talking to actual officers and bringing them in on the research project that you have in mind, you might actually be able to do responsible military history within the academy. And so, again, not Delbruck himself, because Delbruck himself never listened to anyone, but rather the people who were propped up by the academy to go against Delbruck, to argue with him on his various incendiary conclusions and views. Those were people who actually were to count to some extent as, military historians within the academy. Because those are the ones who essentially specialize in military history with the approval of other academics and of the establishment, in order to confront Delbruck with other experts that he might actually respect. And so, people who he might recognize as his equal. And so even though those people aren't called military historians either, they're usually going to be general ancient historians, medieval historians, what have you. Those are then people who informally specialize in military history and train other people to study warfare from the university. It's just what characterizes their work is this consistent respect for and attempt to include military expertise, to work together with officers in order to claim that, look, I'm doing this responsibly, guys, you can't say anything. I'm not just doing this on my own. I'm not just sort of going on my authority as a historian. I'm listening to officers and letting them inform what I do.
Which segues, I think, quite nicely into a subtopic which essentially revolves around, as you put it, two questions, kind of the question of purpose and the question of expertise, i.e., military history, what is it for and whose opinions are valid? Now, we've talked a bit about sort of the whose opinions are valid side of things, where I think to some extent the simple fact that history has become so professionalized means that it's very hard to simultaneously be an officer and a historian at the same time anyway. But I mean, in terms of the question of purpose, I think that seems to be a thing that has obviously changed after the dissolution of the Great General Staff and, at least for a time, the end of a presumption that the next war is coming. So, I mean, how do you develop from there on?
Yeah, so I mean, already in the 19th century, you see people basically questioning the idea that military history exists to teach officers. Right, so this is something that the academy itself obviously questions, because, and even people like Yanes already question, because they will say, look, you can't just read history and then learn from it. History has, its historicization, so it exists in its own period with its own context, and you can only understand it within that context. So you can't just read history and learn the art of the soldier. As they start to question that, the idea of what military history is for slowly changes. You get towards the end of the 19th century, you definitely have a lot of people saying, like, military history isn't really for soldiers. It isn't something that is done in order to instruct you how to do war. With some exceptions, famously, von Schlieffen, as chief of the general staff, read about the Battle of Cannae and allowed that to inspire his ideas of what the great decisive battle was going to look like. But generally speaking, military history is no longer done in the interest of instructing officers, because officers are barely being instructed in military history anyway. They don't really do that anymore. And so they shift towards saying, military history isn't just, it doesn't just exist to instruct officers in the proper way to handle troops and to win battles. It exists in order to understand historical periods. And that is obviously something that the Academy then sort of tries to double down on and say, look, we are doing this as a part of history, right? We're doing military history as an element of universal history. And I mean, Hans Delbrück very explicitly says this in his work. I am not writing for the sake of the army. If the army finds something useful in what I'm doing, then I'm very glad. But I'm writing history as a part of universal history because I feel that this aspect of history, which fits into the political, the social, the economic, etc., has been neglected. And the result of that change in perspective, which is not just Delbrück, I mean, there are others who have very similar attitude towards military history. And because they believe, as I said before, that military history is one of the more activating and relevant aspects of this, of history in general and of scholarship. There starts to be a shift in the way that this is being done, where instead of focusing entirely on the things that officers might find useful, so army organization, weaponry, and tactics for the most part, you start to see more and more of an embedded, contextualized military history, which is what we now might call war and society, this kind of school that we wrongly believe emerged from the 1960s, but actually is much older than that. The idea that warfare doesn't just happen in a vacuum, but exists within historical societies and must be understood within that context. So the change of the answer to the question of what military history is for leads to a change in the way that it's done and the scope that it has, the kind of things that it wants to include within itself. And obviously that ties into the question exactly of who gets to have an opinion on this. The more embedded your military history is, the more it is actually about institutions and societies and political history and economic history. The less officers are going to have anything to say on this, the more this is going to be the field of of historians, of academic historians. And so that is where that shift happens, is as you get a more historicized military history, you must also have historians doing this rather than officers who don't have the background to know this kind of things, to fully study military history as an element of history. There remains pushback even after the dissolution of the GGS, when the government of the Weimar Republic sets out to write the official history of World War I. There is a big committee that is set up to handle the archives of the GGS. Hans Delbrück is on that committee, rather controversially, along with various other people. I mean, Delbrück was actually present during the negotiations for the Treaty of Versailles, along with several other scholars, including Max Weber, because they wanted to make sure that there was a proper sort of intellectual delegation there to judge this from a historical perspective. So Hans Delbrück was considered one of the prominent commentators on these issues, on World War I as it unfolded and afterwards. So he was part of the committee that was supposed to write the official history of World War I, at which point former members of the GGS said, no, look, this is our job. We will do this because this is the war that we fought. The old army, as they put it, fought this war, and the old army will write its history. So there's still this kind of sense, as long as these people are around, that it is their job to write about their job, essentially. So that doesn't change until really way after that. And that happens only after World War II, that you get a clear distinction between the way that military history is done at the university and, this older version of staff military history. But I mean, staff military history continues, and staff military history is still being done. Modern Western armies still have military historical sections. They do their own military historical research. It's just very telling when you look, for instance, at the institutions that do this in Germany, which is obviously the part where I've looked at it more closely, that in the 19th century, it's called the War History section of the Great General Staff. Then afterwards, it becomes the Military Historical Research Institution after World War II. And more recently, it's been turned into the, it's a longer name that it's something like, hold on. Yeah, Center for Military History and Social Sciences of the German Army, which, I mean, the change in the name itself indicates a change in the perception of what these institutions are doing. They are no longer just studying battles and wars in order to educate officers. They are essentially studying the army as a social institution, studying the army as an element of history. They have adopted this broader view of military history, even within armies now. They recognize that this is not something that they can do, studying military history is not something they can do just to get a lot of examples for their, for the instruction of officers, but something that they do because they are themselves an institution with a history, because their history is important to who they are and how they operate. And that the changes that have occurred in history around who they are and what they're like and how they're organized and how they operate, how they plan, all these things, that they matter because they shape the way that things are done today. And so in that sense, since World War II, essentially the academic way of doing military history has more or less taken over, even if there are still, of course, very much military studies or military historical studies that are intended to, describe battles and campaigns in order to draw tactical lessons. I mean, that kind of work obviously still happens. But it is now generally accepted that in order to do military history properly, you really need to work with the historical method. You really need to accept that, wars and conflicts and armies are historical phenomena that fit within a historical context.
I feel like this has preempted what I was about to ask. So what was going to be a question is going to be more like a statement, which is that, in a sense then, what we've been talking about is that the so-called new military history, i.e. this more integrated view of war as an extension of society, is less, genuinely isn't new in terms of its existence. That at most what's new, quote unquote, about it is simply that it has become the dominant mode of approaching it, to the extent even that staff histories, sort of army historical departments have broadened out to encompass it themselves to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, I never thought that I would end up having sort of big things to say about the history of military history in general, when all I started out studying was just the history of writing about Greek warfare. But it seems to me you can very easily point to quotes from the mid-19th century of scholars essentially defining what we call new military history. Well before Delbruck, even before Yanes, you can find quotes of people saying, look, military history is history. It has a historical context. It needs to be seen as a part of what societies and peoples do, not as a sort of detached, timeless, technical thing. So this is very old. And the idea that this emerges only after World War II or even in the 1960s and 70s in this sort of cultural turn or in this sort of anthropological turn within history, it's not necessarily insincere. People may genuinely believe that because they haven't really seen history of that kind being produced previously, or they haven't really recognized it for what it was. I think the difference is not necessarily that military history is being done radically differently or that the ways that we think about it are different, but rather that what has gone away is this deference to officers, is the idea that historians should not have opinions on military history because it is not our field, and that historians should not be able to do military history or should recognize that the way they do it needs to be beholden to the way that officers declare it must be done, which in the 19th century was the big limiting factor. When you read these earlier studies, authors will say, I want to do military history differently. I want it to be embedded. I want it to be in society. I want it to recognize the historical context. You read the study and they don't do that. They actually clearly feel very restricted in what they're allowed to do by the fact that officers are looking over their shoulder and reading their work and saying, look, this is not military history. This is not how we would do it. And this is bad. And you don't know what you're doing. They conform to the template that is being presented to them by the GGS, effectively. Because they can't get away from that. And this is very much a public debate. This is not just some backroom deals or an officer coming to your house at night and knocking on your door with a sword and saying, you can't do this. This is a very public, officers will write reviews of historical books and publish them in newspapers. This is very, very public, right? So everybody can read this. If you write something on military history, regardless of the period you're writing in, even if you're writing about ancient Greece, an officer somewhere will shout at you in a very public place for overstepping your bounds, writing about something on which you have no authority. And that is something that's disappeared. We don't really get told off. I mean, we still do sometimes by other scholars or by people in the general audience who will tell me when I write on Twitter about Greek warfare, oh, but you were never in the army, so what do you know about that? The idea of the authority argument still exists, that you need military experience in order to have a valid opinion on military history. But in scholarship, it's just very rarely brought up. I don't want to say never, because it's been thrown at me. But it very rarely comes up that somebody will say, you shouldn't be writing about military history if you're not a soldier. That level of respect for officers as an alternative intellectual elite, as an alternative body of researchers doing, historical science or scientific history, if you will. That just doesn't exist anymore. A lot of people probably aren't even aware that the army in the US and Germany, everywhere else, is doing military history at an academic level. They're really everywhere. It's just like people don't really seem to think of that as, a viable alternative, let alone a superior alternative to what academic historians are doing. And that means that academic historians are more free to do what they want and to write history in the way that they think methodologically is more justified, which is, generally speaking, to recognize its historical context. But this is not universal, of course. There are still soldiers who write about military history, even ancient military history. There are historians who feel that they write better military history when they apply practical experience from their time in the army, from their time in the reservists or whatever. There are people who believe that you need practical skills to write military history, etc. And of course, there is still a great deal of military history that is the history of battles and campaigns. That is this sort of traditional sense of, let's learn tactical lessons from the ancient Romans or whatever. But generally speaking, military history in the academy now is a much, much broader field that is much more free about what it can be, because it no longer senses that it is under the scrutiny of these professionals who are looking for the practical use of military history.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think we can really add much more than that. That's a really good capstone. Yeah, it's a very neat capstone statement. So I shan't ruin it by trying to go further. Thanks for coming on again.
Yeah, no, it's my great pleasure. I love to rant about this, as you can tell.
No, definitely, and
answers start to be like 10 minutes long.
And listeners will obviously be able to read more of Iphikrates' posts on the subreddit, which have covered some of these in the past, and I'll be sure to link these on the Reddit thread when we announce the podcast. I'll say this again. Thanks for coming on. It's always brilliant talking to you in general, but especially when it can be recorded for a future audience.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate being able to come on again.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.